And influence is a lot like that, right? Most people naturally have influence, and we naturally do certain things that support our influence. But when we actually start to get present to how much influence can support us and what are the basic principles and the habits that highly influential people do, and we start getting intentional about those, then it's actually quite amazing how much your influence can grow and how much word of mouth epidemics will generate around you.
Hello, and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of human ingenuity, clever, inventive, and original thinking. My name is Ken Tenser, curator of Say Hi to the Future and CEO of Spiderworks, a leading business consultancy for mid-market organizations and entrepreneurs globally. With me today is Teresa de Grosbois, the #1 international best-selling author of Mass Influence, The Habits of the Highly Influential, which is now a bestseller in 7 countries. As the founder and chair of the Evolutionary Business Council, Teresa works with people around the world, people who want to create grassroots change in communities and businesses. A 4-time best-selling author, Teresa believes we can shift the thinking of society just by understanding how to generate the spread of positive word of mouth. Like this video if you enjoy our show, and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who you want to see us interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Teresa, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure. I mean, we've known each other for a while. I haven't spoken to you in a few years, or I guess with the pandemic, I haven't seen you in a few years either. But this show is really, it's about passion and what I say, savage curiosity. It's two of the values that really drive me. And from the time that I've known you, from the time that we met, I mean, you have such a passion for influence and positive change in the world. And where did that all come from?
You know, I'd like to say it was something I dreamed up when I was a kid. But in fact, I think it was the opposite. You know, when I was a kid, I was the youngest of a really big family, youngest of 9, often spent our summers in a very remote backwoods setting in northern Canada. So my family was my whole world, and my environment was simply that I was the lowest on the pecking order, being the youngest. And so influence and importance just became so important to me at such a young age because I had none, you know, and so I was always looking for what actually makes people listen to you and what actually has you matter in a situation, you know. And so it became a fascination for me from a very young age, which I think eventually drove me to become an expert in the field.
There you go, influence and probably a few negotiation skills along the way. So, but the influence that you have is it on positive change? And we met, and it's funny, I went on again and was just looking at the Evolutionary Business Council and its beginnings in 2010. And I realized I didn't find our first emails, but I met you just shortly after that.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah. So tell us about the Evolutionary Business Council and your goal to influence or bring positive change to 1.2 billion people.
Yeah, it was, you know, the EBC was actually an idea of like, what if we bring together the change agents of the world, the people that are really up to stuff, that really want to have their lives count for something to make a positive impact in the world? And what if we had them all just really help each other? You know, become more influential, become more profitable, become more effective in business. And it's an idea that just blossomed so quickly once the people started coming together. You know, it became like a tight-knit family community where the members all became wonderful friends. And we're just like the army at each other's back whenever anyone was trying to launch something or spread word of mouth around something. So it's been quite magical to watch what's happened with the Evolutionary Business Council over the years.
And it's amazing. I mean, they say, you know, diamonds are created under pressure. Tell us about that first meeting in 2010. It was actually quite an interesting read again, that first snowy meeting that you had.
Yeah, well, you know, I'd love to say I had a beautiful business plan and this was all, you know, conceived that way. The EBC was more born out of intervention, truthfully. You know, I was teaching about influence and I had hosted a big event in Calgary, which was the city I was living in at the time. And after the event, I invited all the speakers to come up to the mountains with me for the weekend. I just thought it'd be really fun if we would hang out for the weekend. And we're sitting around having a glass of wine, cup of tea that evening, and out of my mouth pops, someday when I'm influential enough, I'd love to start an organization for the change agents of the world to just come and really support each other, to help them grow their influence. And to a person, everyone in the room starts laughing. And I'm like, wait a second, I just told you guys my dream and you're laughing at me? Like, what's going on? And Daniel Gutierrez looks at me. Of course, he's one of the top Latino speakers in the world. And he says, wait a minute, Teresa, you were just on stage 4 hours ago telling people to notice when they say someday I will and invite them to make that day to day. That was literally the speech I was giving. And then Jennifer Huff, who of course many people know, also leads a huge training business, turns to me and she says, so when are you going to do that, Teresa? And that was the moment the EBC was born. Harrison Klein was there, and Dr. Shonda Perrin was there. And they all kind of held my feet to the fire to say, let's do it, And the rest is kind of history. They became the first board of directors, the advisory board for the EBC, and helped me, think through what it would be. And the rest is history. It's been pretty amazing ever since.
Well, I think, as you tell that story, it really, what it's grown into, it really hasn't strayed from that genesis. You were sitting in a room with people who were aware, who were open, who were curious. And I think when you put yourself into that position in life, you have the opportunity to make your dreams come about.
Yeah, it's very true. Until you take action on your dreams, you're just dreaming. So, you want to live your dreams, you got to get into action around them.
So what are the things when you look back that you're most proud of about the EBC when you say, the rest is history? Tell us a little bit about the history. Well,
one of the things I considered early on was I'm probably not the smartest person in the room at any given meeting. When you're pulling together an organization of leaders, thought leaders and emerging thought leaders, people who are really pushing new ideas and new ways of thinking into the world, trying to lead it from a standpoint of everyone being under you and you directing everything, just, it's not going to work. They're too innovative and too brilliant to be led that way, So we actually created a model very early on for the EBC that it's primarily member-led, so the members lead the calls, the members support each other. The members who are strong in certain things, like some members are really strong in LinkedIn or Facebook, so they actually lead calls on those things for the other members, even if that's not their brand, or they help each other with health issues or just dealing with the inner doubt that we all deal with as leaders. I think that's one of the biggest things. As an organization that stands for consciousness, we have quite a few members who teach consciousness inside our work. And by that, I just mean, being able to challenge your own thoughts and not buy into the self-doubt and the negative beliefs that our primitive brain tends to generate on a minute by minute basis, right? And so that's been pretty incredible, actually, having the members themselves lead. I'm often not even speaking at our own retreats because there's so many incredible people in the room there to lead.
That's amazing. And to me, it's like you've created, from mass influence, you've created these circles of influence where people naturally, as you say, take their ideas and they gravitate, they support one another. So when you look at that, when you look at your book, Mass Influence, that #1 in 7 countries, what was it about that really made the whole notion of influence and helping people to change and providing that positive message? What was it that really moved people to read and embrace all of what you do?
Well, I really wrote Mass Influence for the everyday heroes out there, the everyday change agents who, really want to do something good in their communities, in their organizations, in the world at large. And they don't understand how to create that groundswell around what they're doing, And in fact, many of the principles of influence are things that are naturally intuitive, like there's stuff we already know, but we're not placing enough emphasis on it. You know, in influence, I like to compare influence to breathing, you know, because there was a time in your life you had to learn how to breathe. You know, you came out of that nice warm environment, some idiot whacked you on your back, you cried for a minute, and then you mastered the skill of breathing, right? And then after that point, you would never go through your day saying, oh my God, I have to breathe 24/7. Where am I going to find the time? Like, it's not something you generally think about, pardon me, unless, you know, maybe you take yoga or qigong or a martial art, and then you suddenly realize, oh, there's an advanced level of breathing. If I get really intentional about my breathing, it supports everything else I'm trying to do in the world, right? And influence is a lot like that, right? Most people naturally have influence, and we naturally do certain things that support our influence. But when we actually start to get present to how much influence can support us and what are the basic principles and the habits that highly influential people do, and we start getting intentional about those, then it's actually quite amazing how much your influence can grow and how much word of mouth epidemics will generate around you.
And you talk about some of the habits of highly influential people. What are some of those habits? What are the top 2 or 3 that maybe I should know or take away and try today?
Well, I think the biggest one is it's all about relationships, right? Like, so a word of mouth epidemic is nothing more than 200 highly influential people all talking about your work all at the same time, right? That's all it is.
Right.
So then that begs the question, well, how do I get in relationship with 200 highly influential people so that word of mouth epidemics can naturally happen around me, right? And that was one of the reasons we created the Evolutionary Business Council, because it's all people that are either already highly influential on their way to becoming highly influential, right? So when you step into an environment where you can naturally get to know, like, and trust other influential people, and they can know, like, and trust you, then it's far easier to create energy around anything you're up to.
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, that notion of trust, and I think it comes down to, you've created an area where people are open enough to trust. And I think that, I think that, again, you know, when you talk about before, getting away from some of the negativity or the places that we might go to on an everyday level, especially in the last 2 years. I think that's, you know, that positivity and that openness to the people around you. I mean, that certainly as an entrepreneur, I can say that's really helped me in the last 25 years to discover what other people are thinking, to listen to what other people are thinking, and to embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, so mass influence, again, what past that group of, you know, 2 or 3 things, how do I bring that into my everyday life, to my personal life? Because it really, influencing people, as you said, it started from a family of 9 children. How do we open up enough?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, because when you look at the way highly influential people operate, they tend to operate a little bit differently than the average person, right? So there are habits that they tend to do on a routine basis, and those habits just naturally build influence, right? And part of it is the mindset. Like, we learned a certain mindset back in the sandbox in kindergarten, right? We learned, I do this for you and you do that for me. And then we came up into business, and we started learning things like, you want to make a relationship with a colleague, you buy them a coffee or lunch, or you know, you're trying to impress a client, maybe you buy them coffee or give them a gift. And then you only have to phone up the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and faster than you can say gatekeeper, you're going to realize that the highly influential operate by a different set of rules. Suddenly offering to buy them a coffee or lunch is not considered a good thing to do, right? And that's because the more influential a person becomes, the more demands on their time there are, right? Because more people want a piece of them. That's really what it comes down to. Like, I think if you imagine the extremes, like Oprah Winfrey, you can imagine it would be ridiculous to ask Oprah Winfrey for a coffee, because an hour of her time isn't worth a $7 latte, right? It's just not. So in the world of reciprocity, where we're trying to build relationships, you know, Dr. Shonda Perrin talks about this a lot in her work, how we build cycles of reciprocity with people, right? It's important to understand that influential people do it differently, right? So, you know, if you want to meet the new neighbor, you might bring them an apple pie or something like that. but you wouldn't go and ask to borrow the stereo, right?
Right.
That would be considered heavy, right? And yet people do that with influential people all the time. They get a little desperate. They meet the influential person. They get into this mindset, oh, here's my chance. I've got to go get them to endorse my product or endorse my book or get them to recommend me for something. And so they're immediately running over there and making an ask instead of making an offer. It feels heavy. It doesn't feel like good reciprocity. And it just chops any reciprocity that's going on, chops any relationship, and shuts down the possibility of growing influence. So it's important to avoid these kinds of mistakes and instead do what works for influential people.
Right. So it's really it's understanding both sides of the relationship. It's understanding the give and the get to it. So I think that's a great point, and a great point of advice for everybody, whether it's with your children or in business. A whole notion of empathy comes right out of that. Understanding what is motivating the other individual in the room or I don't even want to say on the phone anymore, over Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we take some of our learnings and some of the things we've been talking about? We've been talking about reciprocity and influence and circles of influence and how we build those. When we look at the pandemic, and it's very hard to take good from the last 2 years, but I think as hard as it is, I think it's that important that we step back and I think for me, the first realization was, and you're Canadian, Toronto well. I was driving home the first night that we had to shut down our office, and we thought it'd be a week or two, like some times we'd had, before. And all of a sudden, I realized that we're not just connected through technology. That 7 billion people over a 30-day period were shutting down the way that I was. And that for me was an amazing moment in the car. Just going, this is incredible. Looking around and realizing this is happening in every continent, in every country. And how do we take some positivity or learning from the fact that, yes, we actually all are that closely related?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. They used to talk about the degrees of separation of humanity, and those are collapsing all the time. Like they say, most people aren't more than 3 degrees of separation from each other anymore, which is fascinating that someone in Japan is not more than 3 degrees of separation from someone in, Costa Rica or South America.
Yeah.
And, I think the pandemic has actually made it even more pressing for us to really start to learn the principles of influence, because now the majority of people are now working at home at least some of the time, or they're working on Zoom, even if they are in an office tower. And so isolation is now becoming a risk for humanity, right? Depressions are reaching an all-time high. And so when people actually put their focus out there, like, how can I support others? How can I do something for the world? How can I have an impact for others? And they start focusing on building those relationships, it actually makes a really big difference for the quality of their life and their overall level of happiness, right? Aristotle was the first one who talked about the different types of happiness, right? He talked about hedonistic happiness, which is pursuits of the flesh, right? Like it's the joy you get from that really nice slice of pumpkin pie or the latte or whatever. And there's nothing wrong with hedonistic happiness, but they're fleeting, right? So as soon as the latte is gone, the happiness is gone. And he also talked about eudaimonia. And eudaimonistic happiness is the happiness that comes from knowing you're a deep contribution to the world at large, to your family, to your community. And that happiness settles into your bones and sticks around, right? And that's, one of the reasons I wrote Mass Influence to get out to the world was I also wanted people to understand that, like, becoming influential and actually being up to something in the world is not only important, it's like necessary to our quality of life, right? And so when we actually learn, it's like learning how to breathe really, really well. It significantly takes your stress level down. Learning the habits of influence really, really well actually lights your life on fire and has you be able to really do some cool things that ultimately has happiness just settle into your bones.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, I've never looked at it that way, and the different levels of happiness in that way. And I think that's critical. And it goes, before we started the interview, we were chatting a little bit again, about the pandemic and some of the realizations, and, as well as my realization of how connected we were, I realized how quickly we could exhibit to the world how much change we could bring. And it only took about a week or two for us to see like changes to the environment in major cities when cars were parked, when buses were parked. How do we not lose some of those incredible learnings? One for ourselves, as you said, around happiness and joy and connectivity, but also for the planet around us. I mean, we exhibited, we saw, quantitatively a change in the Earth's environment so quickly. And boy, I just hope we don't go back.
Yeah, I think the pandemic is teaching us a lot of things, right? It's teaching us to not be cavalier about our health, to not be cavalier about our relationships. It's also teaching big industry that they can operate without the big steel towers,
Right.
At least those industries that stand in trust of their employees, and it's interesting. It's like night and day. Some industries are forcing their employees to go into work and sit at computers and work on Zoom from an office because they don't trust they'll get their work done if they're at home. And others are saying, wait a second, we've hired grown-ups and we can tell by their performance if they're working. We don't need them to come into the office. Wow, this is going to save us thousands of dollars a year in not having to make office space if we allow some of them to work at home, and think of the benefits to the environment, the benefits to the health system, so it's fascinating what the pandemic is teaching us, right? And it is teaching us that maybe there is a better way for humanity to live on this planet. I do think, we're also seeing in some areas we've maybe swung the pendulum a little too far. Right. I am personally concerned with some of the loss of individual rights and freedoms that's going on. I think we need to seriously look at those things. But humanity needs to go through these cycles, right? When we go through periods of great strife, it forces certain debates to come to the forefront that need to be debated, and our leaders need to see those debates. That's one of the ways we support the leaders, by what we go out and protest, what we get on the streets and hold up placards against. That's how the people running the countries understand, where society needs to stand, right? So I actually think this is going to be, in the long run, a very telling period in history, because we're having so many significant events happen at once, right? We had the pandemic, which significantly changed the way we think. Cryptocurrency is now hitting tipping points, right? And when I talk about tipping point, I just mean on the adoption curve of something. Right. When you hit about 15% penetration, it becomes inevitable that something becomes a way of doing. Like we saw that with cell phones, with the internet, with social media, right? And we're hitting tipping point energy on a lot of things like cryptocurrency. We're also getting way more black swan events. And by a black swan event, I mean something that it was probably predictable, but we didn't really pay it any attention. Mm-hmm. Like COVID was a black swan event, right? So economically, it was predicted for the last several decades, but we didn't really pay any attention to those predictions. We weren't really prepared when it hit us, And so it's fascinating how much of that is going on at once. And at the same time, humanity's waking up, right? In the sense of more and more companies now are teaching principles of consciousness, like being able to challenge your own thoughts and not accept things at face value, not accept your thoughts at face value, right? Your fears, your insecurities, all that negative self-talk that we all do as human beings. Lots of research on that now. So it's fascinating. It's like there's this perfect storm of massive things changing on this planet. So it'll be interesting to see where we are in 10 years, as the Chinese expression goes, we live in interesting times.
Oh, we definitely do. And I mean, again, I'm hoping, I'm looking, and I'm wishing for the positive to come out of it. Sometimes we need that massive alarm clock. And yes, there's a lot of changes to who we are. I think as individuals, we always love that shiny ball theory. We're looking for that perfect answer, especially in business. And we're thinking that the perfect answer is one thing. I think we realized through the pandemic how much we do need one another. And we do need one
Absolutely.
another more than just in that virtual space, that we need to spend time with one another, that there's something about being in a group, there's something about being in a room full of laughter and joy, rather than, simply again, as a 1 inch by 1 inch on Zoom. So yeah, I mean, maybe that alarm clock says that it is the right time for humanity to look and change and find other ways to live, and not, Toronto has become the longest, well, it had become the longest commute in North America, and that's not something to brag about.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so Teresa, thank you so much for being on the show today. And just as we wrap up, what's that one takeaway? What's the one takeaway maybe about coming out of the pandemic, about channeling our new consciousness that we should learn to live by?
Yeah, I would say unashamedly give yourself permission to take action on your dreams. Be outrageous in your goals, because that's not only the route to happiness, it's the route to a better world. When we really take a stand for our communities, for making change in the world, that's what builds a new and better world.
Teresa de Grosbois, I love that. Be outrageous in your dreams. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my joy. Thanks for having me, Ken.
Yeah.